conversion therapy, full stop, is abhorrent. And so in terms of the legislation that would be introduced under my leadership, it would reflect the fact that conversion therapy is abhorrent.
The second thing is on conversion therapy, and I have given my unequivocal support to plans to ensure that we ban conversion therapy, because it is abhorrent. It has no place in modern Scotland.
So Kate Forbes there is repeating the standard lines in the Scottish Parliament about so-called conversion practices, conversion therapy. It's abhorrent and got no place in modern Scotland. Now, what exactly are these conversion practices, conversion therapy? We'll look at that later in the video in great detail. I mean, quite bizarrely, the Scottish Daily Express had an article today saying that they thought that Kate Forbes would be opposing a conversion therapy ban when it came before the Parliament. How they think that, I do not know, because she's expressing pretty enthusiastic support for it there. Now, we've gone through a few steps to get this at this stage in Scotland. You might remember I made a video about one of the committees when they brought in so-called experts to discuss the conversion therapy ban. They had one lady came in and said that praying for people can be as harmful as electric shock therapy. And they had other people saying that conversion therapy, like speaking to people about their sexuality or gender, encouraging them to help make the changes that they want to make, that this was a form of torture. And therefore, because it's a form of torture, people can't consent to it. So even when someone says they would like someone to help them to move their life in the direction that they want, if someone actually helps them with that, then that is a form of torture, which is obviously laughable, but this is the Scottish Parliament, and it passed largely without comment. Now, this conversion therapy ban concept, a lot of people are very concerned about it now, but I would encourage people to reflect at this point that if you voted for the SNP or the Greens or the Lib Dems or Labour or the Conservatives at the last Scottish election, you voted for a conversion therapy ban. It was in the manifesto of every one of those parties. Now, in the coming months, we'll probably hear the Scottish Conservative Party trying to just distance themselves from it a little bit, criticise one aspect a little bit, and they'll try and give the impression, or people might even get the impression, that the Conservatives are the ones opposing this. The Conservatives had it in their manifesto at the last Scottish election. So we're now at the point where a consultation has been opened, and the consultation text basically includes what would be the text of the bill. So we've got the law in draft at this point. One thing that's worth saying here is looking at the draft of the law, it could be worse. There are a couple of ways in which they're obviously trying to avoid criticism, they're trying to avoid it applying in certain particularly extreme situations. So that's sort of a positive. But one of the big negatives about this, apart from the whole concept of it, is the fact that it's incredibly vague. Now, reading through it, I feel the same as I did when I was reading through the proposed buffer zone legislation. You just can't understand what it would apply to and what it wouldn't. With buffer zones, there's a perfectly simple, important case. A couple of people stand outside the abortion clinic praying silently. You're allowed to do that or not. You read the bill and you think, don't know, can't tell. Similarly with this, young man goes to church leader saying, I'm experiencing same-sex attractions. I don't want to go down that road. Can you pray with me? Can you advise me? Can you help me with this? And the church leader says, yes, sure. Let's have a chat about it. I'll pray with you. And, come and see me next week. Now, is that classed as conversion therapy or conversion practice? You can read this whole document. You can read this whole bill. And the answer you're left with is, don't know. So is this vagueness, this imprecision, is it incompetence? Or is it deliberate? Are they thinking if we make this vague and undecipherable, people will just think, I better play safe and avoid it completely? Well, to be honest, I don't think that's the case. I think it is actually just incompetence. The people in the Parliament, they write these laws and it's just very unclear what they mean. Now, it's a very important part of an open democratic society with the rule of law that you have laws that people can understand. If you've got a law that says you will be punished for doing this, and people look at it and think, I don't understand what that is, I don't know if I'm allowed to do this or not, then that's a problem. That's a very serious problem. And the Scottish Government specialises in producing laws that people can't make head and tail of and can't work out how to apply them, including the police. in the case of the stirring up hatred legislation. Now, a lot of church leaders and other religious leaders in Scotland are very concerned about this, but I think the Scottish Government obviously is going to make a blunder, same as with the buffer zones. Do they really think that's going to suppress the viewpoints they want to suppress? More likely the opposite. History shows that when there's persecution of the church, of Christians, maybe this applies to other faiths as well, the result tends to be growth and increasing commitment among those people. Now, that won't happen if the church makes a classic mistake, and the mistake would be when this bill is passed, which it will be passed, and then some church leader will find themselves in court. It probably won't be someone from a respectable, middle-class, quite prim and proper evangelical church, or it won't be a Catholic priest that find themselves in the dock. Probably be someone from a bit more of a, maybe a rough and ready, more working class, sort of church where people speak from the heart a bit more unguardedly. And the mistake that other church leaders could make is then to say, "Oh, I can see why he's in court. He's not as wise as us. If he'd have been just that little bit wiser and done it the way we do it, then he'd been fine." Then that would be disaster. But if the church is united and church leaders united and take it as an opportunity to present their message to people, then it could be very useful indeed. Now, this document that the government's produced for the consultation, I think it's about 90 pages long altogether. There's an awful lot in it. And I'm going to go through it in some detail to look at what the bill says, but also to look at what comes out about the attitude of the Scottish Government towards traditional moral teaching about homosexuality and gender identity, because that is as important almost as the actual content of the bill and what they're trying to make illegal. So we're going to go through it in great detail, because in the coming months this is going to be a big focus in Scotland. There'll be a lot spoken about this, and there'll be quite a lot spoken that might well not be true. And if you want to actually start off this period of debate on this topic with as full an understanding as you can get of the range of issues involved, then I would encourage you to settle down to this video and take it all in, and that might be a good preparation for the months to come. Now, the paragraphs in this consultation document are numbered, just sequentially from the beginning to the end. And where I'm putting the text on the screen, you'll see the numbers there. And there's a link below to the whole document, so if you want to read it in the original, you can do that. So, let's go. So we'll go to the Ministerial forward. This is by Emma Roddick, the Minister for Equalities, Migration and Refugees. She became an MSP through a unique qualification, which was a mental health problem with which we will obviously sympathise. But the SNP system was, in order to get to the top of a list in a region, you had to have some sort of disability, and her mental health problem qualified her for that. Therefore, that enabled her to get to the top of the list and get elected as an MSP. And now she's in charge of this very important area of legislation. So let's see what she's got to say. Conversion practices which aim to change or suppress a person's sexual orientation or gender identity are damaging and destructive acts that violate the human rights of those who undergo them. Damaging and destructive acts. Well, there's a lot of evidence that shows positive effects from them as well. Now, all that positive evidence, peer-reviewed academic research, is completely ignored by the Scottish Government. Totally and utterly ignored. They just say it's damaging and destructive, and they come to that conclusion by ignoring all the evidence that it's not, and that it can have positive effects. And it violates the human rights of those who undergo them. She doesn't say what human right it is. I mean, the human right not to get counselling and support for something that you want help with? Is that the human right? I don't know what she's talking about there. Sadly, these practices happen today, and they have absolutely no place in Scotland. She forgot to say modern Scotland. That's the standard line that everyone parrots. No place in modern Scotland. We are committed to bringing to an end conversion practices and to protect LGBTQI plus people from the trauma and harm they can cause. This trauma is basically self-reported. So I believe the main source of these reports are by activists who hate the idea of conversion therapy. We'll talk about that a bit later. And so if you want to make your case as strong as possible, what do you report about your own experience of so-called conversion practices? Well, you say it's very, very traumatic. Now, if you're a researcher in a university, you can gather together quite a large group of people who are activists and wanting to demonise conversion practices. You can get them to tell lots of stories about it. And I believe that is a large part of the so-called research that brings out this trauma that can be caused. Right, in 2020, the United Nations Independent Expert on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity calls for a global ban on conversion therapy. Right, United Nations and independent, those don't really go together in the way that a lot of people might think. The United Nations tend to be seen as something above the hurly-burly of national politics. It's like the pinnacle of moral accountability and justice in the world. But it's not. I mean, the United Nations in this area, for example, has been captured by activists. Now, by captured, I don't mean like they threw a grenade in and burst in and took over the place at gunpoint. What I mean is it's been infiltrated. People with a particular perspective have come to dominate and to set policy in certain areas. And therefore, the United Nations independent expert isn't independent in any meaningful way at all. The United Nations is just a campaigning organisation alongside Stonewall, say, when it comes to these areas. Now, in the Scottish Parliament, the United Nations and the human rights, whatever, I mean, that's their religion substitute. If the United Nations say that, that's like the same as if you're in Iran and you say, it's in the Quran. It's the same sort of system that operates there. Now, in terms of research into so-called conversion therapy, conversion practices, there's a substantial amount of research that shows it's having positive results. In other words, people's mental health or the problems they were experiencing before are alleviated. There's also substantial evidence that it can work as well. People can go in with one sexual orientation, one sort of sexual attraction, one sort of gender identity, and through going through some sort of support can come to the point where that is no longer their sexual orientation or their gender identity. Now, no one's claiming that these are like surefire solutions. These are things that always work. But dealing with these programs, there are a significant number. I mean, to put a figure on it, to average out lots of studies, like maybe a third of people who undertake this sort of support, this sort of counselling, would say there was some sort of positive, very substantial change in their sexual orientation. So for a significant number of people, it does work. Right, let's carry on. Ensuring that fundamental rights already enjoyed by people in Scotland, such as freedom of religion and the right to family and private life, are upheld. So Emma Roddick thinks that this bill is going to uphold the right to freedom of religion and uphold the right to family and private life. Now, obviously, because she said it, it must be true. So we don't need to worry about these things at all, because she said we don't need to worry about them. And as far as they're concerned in this document, you can forget about that for the rest of it. But obviously, this is exactly where the concern is, and these concerns are not addressed in the rest of the document at all. Well, she says, from our knowledge of conversion practices through expert advice, data gathering and analysis, it's clear that limiting legislative action to sexual orientation does not go far enough. So this conversion therapy ban needs to cover gender identity as well. So if a person says, I'm a man, but I've really got this sort of overwhelming desire sometimes, or feeling that I'm really a woman, I really don't want this because it's not true. Can you help me? And if the person says, yeah, I agree with you, yeah, I'll try and help you, then that needs to be criminalising. So I would imagine going forward, the gender identity section of this will be quite controversial. I imagine there'll be the feminist groups will be against it. Then the Conservatives will come along behind the feminist groups, popping up their head over their shield, saying, yeah, we agree with them as well. But I imagine a lot of debate will say, oh yes, that we don't need this for transgender. Everybody knows it's really bad for sexual orientation. Yeah, we certainly need a ban for conversion therapy with regard to sexual orientation, but we don't need it for gender identity. That's a different thing altogether. I'm guessing that will be the mainstream sort of objection to this bill, which I don't think is the right approach to take. We'll talk about that later on. Right, then Emma Roddick talks about this consultation. She says, your responses to this consultation are of great interest, as I am keen to understand the range of views and consider what steps we in Scotland must take. The practices addressed in these proposals are not only harmful, but a violation of the human rights and dignity of people in Scotland. In other words, I'd like to hear your opinion, but I'm going to remind you we've already decided what the outcome is. I mean, just as a matter of self-awareness, who could write those two sentences next to each other? Please give us your opinion in this consultation, and then after that, hammering home that they've already decided that conversion practices are a violation of the human rights and dignity of the people of Scotland. Now, that language there is absolutely hysterical, but that is routine when it comes to conversion therapy. Let's quick look in the introduction. It talks about the UK government committed to a conversion therapy ban in its 2018 LGBT action plan. Now, if you follow this, the UK Conservative government has been all over the place on this issue. They've put it in their manifestos. Some prime ministers have said, yep, we're going to do it. Others have said, yes. I mean, Boris Johnson said he would. He just kept changing backwards and forwards, said trans is in it, trans is not in it. The current situation with the UK government is they've backed off it, which is the right decision. But of course, we're having a Labour government next time. Labour will introduce it in the blink of an eye. And then will the next Conservative government, whatever century that comes in, will they repeal it? Will they sort it out? No. Because the way politics operates in Britain is if we're going to take a bad step in the so-called progressive direction, then either Labour will do it, no problem at all, they'll just go right ahead and do it. The Conservatives might well do it as well. But if the Conservatives don't, then don't worry, the Labour will do it next time, then the Conservatives won't undo it. So it's a one-way street in the progressive direction, and this conversion therapy ban is going to illustrate that. I mean, the Conservatives all over the place, so at the end of this, Labour will do it, and that will be that. The introduction makes reference to the Expert Advisory Group on Ending Conversion Practice. This was a group that was brought together by the Scottish Government. I mean, these experts were all basically sort of LGBT campaigners or anti-conversion therapy campaigners. I mean, what is the point of bringing together a group of people when your selection criteria is that you already know what the people think? And you could say that before it starts. So a total waste of money running this thing, because it's obviously going to say the views of all the people that are in it. There are also some bizarre things in it. For example, they want to cover the sort of race issue as well. So they need some black and minority ethnic voices. So they went and found a sort of LGBT positive church or Christian group down in London to contribute to it as well. Whereas imagine a lot of religious groups in Scotland wouldn't have got near that expert so-called group. So a bit more from the background section here. It says, conversion practices are harmful to individuals subjected to them. Right, disagree. They're promoted within an ideology that views LGBTQI plus identities as wrong and believes that they can be changed. So it's saying the problem with this is not just the practice, it's the ideology behind it. And the ideology is that LGBTQ plus identities are wrong. In other words, if you think homosexual relationships are immoral, in other words, if you believe the teachings of the mainstream Christian churches, Islamic faith, etc., if you believe that, then your ideology is something that the Scottish government is seeking to attack and basically eliminate from modern Scotland. And the belief that they can be changed as well. Do you believe people can change sexuality? In other words, do you believe the people who say they have changed sexuality? And there's an awful lot of them. So when you hear someone saying, yeah, I was gay, exclusively sexually attracted to men, but then I decided I didn't want to do that, and so someone helped me with that. We talked it through, and look at where sometimes there might be a religious element in there as well. And so look at where I am now. It's completely changed, and I'm married with a wife very happily, and homosexual inclinations have gone completely. Now the Scottish government would say to that person, you liar. That cannot be true, because it is not possible. Whereas I would say to that person, okay, that's great. It's great for two reasons. One reason is I think you've done the right thing. The other reason is it's what you wanted. As far as you're concerned in your life, it's a step in the right direction. It then says the existence of conversion therapy contributes to this way of thinking even further. In other words, the conversion therapy is not just the ban, it's what it implies. So if you allow conversion therapy, it's as though you're allowing people to think that actually maybe same-sex attraction is not desirable. Maybe being gay might not be what someone wants. Maybe being transgender might not be what someone wants. And someone might want to change from that. And the implication here from the government is they do not want people to believe that. That belief is abhorrent to them, and they want to eliminate that belief from modern Scotland, and the conversion therapy ban is one part of achieving that goal. I won't achieve it completely because a lot of other people still hold those views. This legislation specifically aims to protect people from the harm of conversion practices, and in doing so contributes to the broader protection of human rights and respect for the dignity of LGBTQI+ people. Now, just going back to this issue of people changing sexuality, there's very substantial evidence that that's happened with a lot of people. But the other thing as well, there's also statistical evidence where you take a group of people, how many of you are gay and how many of you are straight or whatever, and then you ask the same people 10 years later, what do you think happens? Do you get exactly the same answers every decade? And the answer is no. A significant number of people change the answer they give to those questions. Now, that's nothing to do with conversion therapy. It's just naturally over time, people change, particularly females, more than males, but males as well can just change. But as far as the Scottish government's concerned, it's totally blind to any evidence from that direction. On to the next page here. It talks about international practice, other countries that have banned conversion therapy. It mentioned Malta. You might remember Matthew Grech, a friend of the Scottish Family Party, who was on their version of X Factor, and he spoke about his journey out of homosexuality into heterosexuality in the context of his Christian faith. He spoke about that. He was thrown off the show, but that's small fry because he's now basically facing criminal prosecution for promoting conversion therapy, even though all he did was told his story. But the Scottish government cite Malta as an example of good practice, and that's the direction that we're heading in. Right, still in the background section, it says there's no international universal definition of the term conversion practices, which is quite a mission really, because they've been talking about all the evidence around the world for conversion practices and what effect they have. But if you can't even define it, then it's quite difficult to know how this evidence can exist in any meaningful sense. So it says here, conversion practices are inherently harmful. Not true. They deny people's right to be themselves. I mean, what does that mean? And send a message to the LGBTQI+ community as a whole that their identity is wrong and can and should be fixed or suppressed. Now, this is the same idea, you see. It's not just something that needs criminalising because the practice is dangerous. The real motivation behind it, in my view, is they don't like the message it sends. And they're saying the message is LGBTQI+ people their identity is wrong and it should be fixed. But it doesn't send that message. The fact that conversion therapy, as they call it, exists somewhere, the message that actually conveys is that some people believe that LGBTQI+ identities or lifestyles are not positive, and they would encourage people to not go down that road for a whole variety of reasons. And it also implies that some people who might be inclined to go down an LGBTQI+ route don't want to. That's what it implies. And these campaigners cannot bear the thought that anyone exists with that point of view. They want every single person in Scotland to believe that if you're LGBTQI whatever it was plus, that is just fantastic. We're right behind you. Well done. That's really brave. We think that's really fantastic. They want everybody to take that point of view. And everyone who finds themselves same-sex attractive or experiencing gender confusion, they want every single person to think, right, this is great. This is the road for me. Please affirm me in my decision. But that's not the way the world is. And no matter how hard the Scottish government tries, no matter how repressive they are, they're not going to eliminate those viewpoints. But reading this document, it looks like they're going to try pretty hard. Okay, carrying on. Forms of post-traumatic stress disorder can result from the internalized conflicts between, on the one hand, sexual orientation and gender identity, and on the other hand, attempts by family, faith, or other close communities to change or suppress that orientation or identity. So, You've got a child, boy says, I think I'm a girl. Then if you say, I don't think you really are, or it wouldn't be a good idea to dress up in a dress, that's not a good thing to do, then that would be suppressing or trying to change gender identity. And they're saying here that that can cause PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Again, ludicrous, hyperbolic, hysterical nonsense, but it's just standard fare in the Scottish Parliament. Attempts by family, faith or other close communities to change it. So you see, it really is demonising people with socially conservative views within their churches, within their own families as well. You can see where this is heading. So conversion practices result in, I list a few things. One of them is difficulty with sexual function. Hang on, let's have a think about this. So let's say someone's same-sex attracted, they have so-called conversion therapy, and then have difficulty with sexual function. Doesn't that seem to suggest that it might be working? Could it be? I don't know. That might be one way of looking at it. Another result of it, they say, is deep spiritual harm have been rejected by losing families, communities, or losing their faith. Right, I'm not sure as the government's department to be assessing what amounts to spiritual harm to a person. I think that's above their pay grade, let's put it that way. Harm have been rejected by losing their families, communities, and losing their faith. In other words, if a person wants to go down an LGBTQI plus route and their faith community is saying, we don't think this is a good idea, and as a result the person loses their faith or feels that they don't fit in with that community anymore, well, the Scottish government is saying this is a problem we're going to solve. How are they going to solve it? You'd assume the way they want to solve that ultimately is that any faith community must be entirely accepting of any of these things that are against the core teachings of their religious tradition. So continuing from the defining conversion practices section of the consultation, it says those who have experienced conversion practices report a broad range of conduct being carried out against them. Carried out against them. What sort of things are done against these people? Common forms of conversion practice described by victims include the use of talk therapy, counselling. They counselled against me. They talked to me, but they talked. I mean, the language is just ridiculous. Things done against them. That sounds like it's going to be some sort of violence, isn't it? And they also talk about certain faith-based practices are used against people. What do you think those certain faith-based practices might be? That they'd rather not say. They'd be a bit embarrassed to actually name them. What could it actually be? Well, it's obviously what it is, isn't it? It's prayer. So they're talking about using prayer against someone by praying that their unwanted same-sex attraction can be overcome, for example. Now, quite sinister language. Right, next thing we've got here. It says it does not include non-directive and ethical guidance. So in other words, it will be legal to give non-directive and ethical guidance. Right, how can ethical guidance be non-directive? I mean, the very nature of ethical guidance is it would include this is right, this is wrong. So it just doesn't make sense. It hasn't been thought through properly. You're allowed to give ethical guidance, but you're not allowed to tell someone that they shouldn't do something. Okay, let's move on from that one. Similarly, the legislation does not apply to non-directive or non-coercive discussions, questioning guidance, or general parental direction. So here we have it again, like contradiction within the same sentence. It doesn't apply. So if it's non-directive, that's fine, but it's also fine if it's general parental direction, which obviously is directive. So what do they mean by that? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. The distinction here is that these allow an individual to come to their own decision, whatever that may be, and does not direct them to a particular predetermined sexual orientation or gender identity that is considered preferable. Such instances will not be considered conversion practice within legislation. In other words, you're allowed to give general parental direction so long as it's not based on the assumption that any sexual orientation or gender identity is preferable. So I don't really see what allowance they're making there. Right, next one. It says, this core intention To change or suppress another person's sexual orientation or gender identity also distinguishes conversion practices from general statements of belief or opinion. For example, other acts, including general statements which may be upsetting, offensive, or harmful, would not be considered to be a conversion practice if there's no intention to change or suppress a specific person's sexual orientation or gender identity. So they're saying you can express your traditional moral views in general, and that may be upsetting, offensive, or harmful. That's the view of the Scottish Government. So the view of the Scottish Government is that the traditional teachings of Christianity, Islam, etc., are upsetting, offensive, and harmful. It's almost as if we're not dealing with those at the moment. We'll deal with those in the future, but we're not dealing with those for the time being. So it only becomes a crime when it's specifically targeted to one person. Now, I mean, the reasons why people have these views that certain sexualities, for example, are not good, there's a whole host of reasons, logical, related to faith as well, but also in terms of practical outcomes. If you look at the practical outcomes for people who engage in homosexual relationships, basically they're not good. Mental health, physical health, relationship stability, addiction, I mean, you name it. Problems are associated with going down that path. So there's very good reasons for people to say to children, young people, any person, this is not a good road to go down. It's a perfectly reasonable, rational point of view. Right, continuing with the definition, what do they mean by suppressing sexual orientation or gender identity? Well, here it is. They say, we define suppression as acts that seek to repress and or prevent the development or manifestation of another person's sexual orientation or gender identity. Prevent the development or manifestation. So if someone is developing a transgender identity, not they've got it, they are developing a transgender identity. If you seek to suppress that, then you're conversion therapying according to the law. Now you would be breaking the law. And manifestation. So if you've got, say, a child, young person, teenager, whatever, experiencing same-sex sexual attraction, I mean, how would that manifest itself? One would assume it would be manifest by entering into a same-sex relationship or same-sex sexual relationship, and is saying this cannot be suppressed. This must be allowed to come to fruition, which I think is very controversial. It says repress means to prevent or subdue something, often through force. And through force, anything through force is already illegal. That's completely irrelevant to mention through force. But again, it's just trying to keep the hysterical language boiling in people's minds. Right, so it gives some examples of the type of acts that can be considered having the intention to suppress another person's sexual orientation or gender identity. So these are the things that would be illegal. Prescribing medication to suppress a person's sex drive. Now, I've never thought of that. Maybe barely knew such medication existed. But let's say you've got someone who's tormented by sexual attractions that they do not want. They do not act on, they do not want, they're blighting their life. And they go to a doctor and say, is there anything you can do to help me with that? And the doctor would have to say, well, there is, but I'm not allowed to. Because the Scottish Parliament's voted and passed a law that says I'm not allowed to give you medication to suppress that sex drive. Which to me seems very odd indeed. Next thing that won't be allowed, therapy or counselling that requires a person not to act on their same-sex attraction, including through celibacy. Okay, so if the church leader says, okay, you've got these same-sex attractions, I would encourage you not to act on them. Don't enter into a homosexual relationship. Don't engage in homosexual practices. That would definitely be illegal. Now, this bill, it's obviously designed to be talking about LGBT, but it does apply to all. So the same would apply to a heterosexual couple. So let's say, or person. So let's say a Christian leader says, I would encourage you not to act on your heterosexual desires and to refrain or abstain from heterosexual sexual activity until you're married. You should be celibate until you're married. Then I think that would come under the definition of conversion therapy that we've got here. It's also another example of something that would be illegal. Controlling a person's appearance, clothes, makeup, hairstyle. So if a parent said, no, you're not going to wear that, or you're not going to put that makeup on, no, that hairstyle's not okay, then that would be classed as conversion therapy. Now just listen to this bit. This is wild. Our proposed approach to legislation will not criminalise acts of suppression freely undertaken by a person themselves, such as celibacy. Well, hey, thanks, Scottish Government. It's not going to be illegal to not have sex, to choose not to have sex. I mean, what? We're in some sort of parallel universe here when the government thinks they need to say this. But if you say to someone else, I encourage you not to have sex, then that's suppressing their sexuality, and that's conversion therapy, and that's illegal if other conditions are met. I mean, this really is crazy. The legislation will be carefully developed to ensure the exercise of parental responsibilities and rights, such as direction and guidance, which place limits on a child, will not be impacted. Total contradiction to what's come before. It's saying you cannot say to a child or anyone else, you can't wear that. And yet they're saying parental direction is fine. What they mean is parental direction is fine as long as it doesn't meet our definition of so-called conversion therapy. This section here that's quite odd. So into the criminal law section at the moment, it's talking about how existing legislation doesn't actually cover conversion therapy. So what existing legislation does it talk about? That, it's leaving the gaps that enable conversion therapy to take place. Well, stalking legislation, what's that got to do with it? Threatening or abusive behaviour, nothing to do with it. Domestic abuse, nothing to do with it. But as far as the Scottish Government's concerned, so-called conversion therapy is in the same bracket as these crimes here. So we're now looking at the criminal offence itself. And there's two acts that can be classed as a criminal offence. The first one they call provision of a service. We'll go into that in more detail in a while. The classic case with that would be someone setting themselves up, putting an advert out saying, I provide therapy for people with unwanted same-sex attraction, or I supply therapy for people who got transgender identity and don't want it. So I'm an expert in this field. Come to me and you can go through my program, and I think it will help you. That's slam dunk. I mean, that's the criminal offence. That's like the definition of it. That's a classic case of it. And the other thing is a coercive course of behaviour. So this is, you're not setting yourself up as an expert. This can be in other contexts. The classic context would be home, within the family home. But you do things or say things on an ongoing basis, not just once, at least twice, that have the effect of encouraging someone to change or suppress their sexuality or gender identity. So they're the two acts. In addition to those, there are three other conditions before it can be a crime. The first condition is this act needs to be targeted, if you like, at a specific individual. And the next thing is it needs to have the intent to change, suppress. You know that already. And the last thing is some harm has to result from it, physical or psychological harm. Now, as far as I'm concerned, that condition is absolutely useless. If you've got someone who's complaining about this, what sort of person is going to complain? It's only going to be people with the LGBT activist mindset. They'll be the people complaining. Now, will they say, okay, I think it was conversion therapy, that's what they did to me, but actually didn't do me any harm? No, of course not. Of course they're going to make up. They've been traumatized by it, they haven't been able to sleep, they're having flashbacks, really damaged their mental health and disrupted, etc., etc. So it's inevitable that everyone making reports of conversion therapy, the conversion therapy was carried out against them, as they put it, will inevitably claim that there's been some terrible psychological harm done to them as a result of it. So what's it say next? It says the conversion practices offence must relate to a specific individual. The proposals in this legislation do not target hatred towards sexual orientations and gender identities more general. For example, the statement that being gay is sinful or that transgender identity does not exist. So according to the Scottish Government, saying that being gay is sinful or saying that transgender identity, well, there's no such thing, that is hateful. That is hate. So again, it really sounds like the Scottish Government here is saying, we're going to get around to dealing with this eventually because we're going to eliminate hate from modern Scotland. But for the time being, this particular bill doesn't tackle this type of hatred, which for anyone who believes that traditional moral values This would be very concerning. Yeah, so saying if these statements of belief are not made in relation to a particular individual, they won't be a criminal offence under this legislation. How long before someone tries it under the stirring up hatred legislation, but they wouldn't be under this legislation. Right, the next bit about the provision of a service. Remember I talked about some sort of expert, setting themselves up as an expert. Let's look at what this in the guidance here. So provision of a service, the intention behind this part of the offence is to address the situation where a conversion practice is undertaken by a person who claims to have particular knowledge, skill or expertise, and where the act is purported to be delivered as or used as a method to effect a change or suppression. Right, person with particular knowledge, skill or expertise. Is that a church leader? Debatable. You could argue yes. You could argue no. You could say, well, they're not setting themselves up as a therapist or a counsellor. But you could say they are claiming to have particular knowledge, skills or expertise relative to that. Most church leaders, would say they had some expertise in pastoral care, in helping people with their personal issues. So this is a really crucial, key fact about the interpretation of this bill. And we just don't know. It's written in a way that leaves us unable to answer that most important and basic question. Is that deliberate or not? I don't know. Let's carry on. Keep thinking about the church leader situation here. It says, these acts typically have a high coercive element due to the status or position of the perpetrator, and as a result, they have an enhanced potential for harm. They are usually carried out by a person in a position of power, both because the victim is in a position of dependency for that service and because there is often a related claim of knowledge, expertise and or experience. Right, would that fit a church leader? I would suggest it probably would. A victim is more likely to trust, accept or feel obliged to follow the advice of someone they consider to have expertise. Someone sets themselves up as a religious teacher or has the position of a religious teacher, then yeah, victims, so-called, are more likely to accept what they've got to say. The acts are purported to be healing or reparative in relation to an individual's sexual orientation or gender identity. Healing, again, I think that term probably they've got in mind the way that's used in some Christian circles. For example, services that claim to provide a remedy for unwanted same-sex attraction and gender confusion. So they're saying that's the sort of thing that's wrong. A service that claims to be a remedy for unwanted same-sex attraction or gender confusion. Now, I don't think anyone sets themselves up saying it's a remedy, but they're going to try and help. They're trying to help a person to address those issues in their life. So they're very specific about that. This conflicts with a clear medical consensus that it is not possible to bring about such a change and the conversion practices do not work. Right, is that a medical consensus? It's a medical consensus to the extent that the medical community has been captured by LGBT activists who, instead of following the evidence, just use the forum of the academic profession to promote their own ideology. And I think that happens to a very significant degree. Let's carry on about the same idea. For example, where a parent without any relevant background or purported expertise researches and carries out something they consider to be therapy, they are not providing a service. Okay? They might get caught in the other side of the legislation, but it wouldn't be classed as a service. Nor is a religious leader who has an informal conversation with someone about doctrinal views in relation to their sexual orientation or gender identity. Right, what makes a conversation informal? Is that just if it's over the meal table? If you say, come and see me at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, let's talk it through, does that then not be informal? You're allowed to talk about doctrinal views, so you can say to someone, basically, I believe that is against God's will. I believe that's wrong, and is something that people shouldn't do. You're allowed to say that, but you're not allowed to actually try and direct them or urge them to change or help them to change. So in other words, it seems like the message to church leaders to some degree is you can say to someone, and God's view is that the road you're thinking about heading down here, or the road you're heading down is wrong. That's not the way you ought to go, but I can't help you. I can't help you anything. I can tell you it's wrong, but anything I might do to support you or help you to deal with that, I'm not allowed to do that because that's illegal. Maybe you could, go down the road to England and find someone who could help you. But I'm in Scotland, so I can't have any further conversation with you about that, I'm afraid. Now, in terms of helping people's mental health or whatever, what sort of experience would that be for someone in a church who basically the minister's only allowed to deliver the bad news part of his message? He can't deliver the part of the message about help, support, hope, because that section would be illegal. Okay, so I've talked a bit about provision of a service. That's one way of committing the offence of conversion therapy. The other way is through a coercive course of behaviour. Now, what does that mean? Let's look at the definition. It says it's one or more acts are performed in a repeated, continuous or sustained way. And where the behaviour is also coercive. So this can't be a one-off. It's got to be happening at least twice. Well, there's got to be at least two incidents for it to be classed as coercive behaviour. Right, but let's see what it means. Those with lived experience, which you could translate as those with an axe to grind, a bit of both, tells us that the most common form of conversion practices in Scotland is that of a series of informal actions conducted over a period of time. So you can imagine what they've got in mind here is someone telling a story of how their parents treated them. They might say, Dad said this, I said it was wrong and I shouldn't do that. Then Dad said I wasn't allowed to wear a dress. And then Dad said, I don't think you're really a girl, I think you should, etc. And so that pattern, I think, could well be classed as a pattern of coercive behaviour. But I suppose the good news here is this doesn't seem to cover a conversation on a bus. So if it is a genuinely one-off conversation with someone, so I think that might be the case. I mean, having said that, at which point of the police investigation and the legal process they might realise that you're not covered by it, who knows? So the chilling effect would be quite significant. And also say a street preacher as well, I think would be relatively safe from this law unless they enter into a conversation with an individual who's there. And what will happen there, of course, often individuals try to encourage a street preacher to engage in individual conversation with themselves. So that might become a bit of a game to try and get people prosecuted. So what next? Advice and guidance from a religious leader, which includes statements of traditional faith beliefs and sexual ethics, would also have to be demonstrably coercive through evidence of emphatic directives accompanied by forceful or threatening statements intending to pressure the individual person into changing or suppressing their orientation or identity. Now that maybe sounds a little bit reassuring, doesn't it? But what's an emphatic directive? You really ought to do this. This is what God thinks you ought to do. If you want to live God's way, this is what you need to do. Is that an emphatic directive? Who knows? The thing is with these explanatory sections, the text of the bill is extremely unclear what it means. Then here they're trying to explain what it means, but they keep chopping and changing it. It's very vague. It's all over the place. So even when they're trying to make it clear, just in free text, what the bill's intended to mean, they can't do it. Right, so it goes on to say that we believe that coercion to be the defining feature. And it gives a non-exhaustive list of examples of coercive behaviour with regard to conversion practices. Right, so we've got violent, threatening or intimidating towards the victim. Already illegal, so pointless having those in a new bill. Controlling the victim's day-to-day activities. Now note the victim language, but let's imagine that's a child and Dad says to the boy, no, boys don't wear dresses, you're not allowed to wear that. Because you're a boy, boys don't wear dresses. Then that would be controlling of day-to-day activities, obviously, wouldn't it? Next one, manipulative or pressurizing the victim to act in a particular way. Manipulative. Now, how many people would claim or would believe that if you say, this is what God wants, how many people would regard that as being manipulative? I think a lot of people would regard that as manipulative. Or pressurizing the victim to act in a certain way. So if you say, within our church, within our faith community, this is not something that's morally acceptable. And so it's not something we think that you ought to do. how many people would interpret that as pressurising the victim to act in a certain way? Well, I think a lot of people would. Would a judge? Very possibly. Who knows? Problem with that is, if it comes to, well, I don't think the judge would probably convict on that one. But do people really want to go through the whole process? Have to defend themselves in court? And then eventually, maybe it wasn't quite classed as pressurising? It's a very chilling effect. The last one, frightening, humiliating, degrading or punishing the victim. I mean, degrading, that's the most subjective one there. Did you feel degraded? You can imagine a lot of campaigners would say, oh yes, I felt very degraded by the way they spoke about LGBTQI plus issues. Right, let's carry on. By controlling, we refer to actions that regulate, restrict or monitor a person's behaviour or otherwise deprives them of their own freedom of action. Now, it seems to be that the Scottish Government believes it doesn't take much to deprive someone of their own freedom of action, but they often seem to think that LGBTQI plus people can't make decisions for themselves. The things they choose to do are entirely outside of their control, outside of their personal agency. So, for example, preventing someone from dressing in a way that reflects their sexual orientation or gender identity. That's particularly relevant in the family home, where parents might want to say to a child, no, we don't want you to do that. We don't. That's right. That's not helpful. We don't want you to go down that road. So they're saying that's controlling behaviour. Preventing someone associating with certain people or undertaking certain activities considered to be linked to their sexual orientation. Right, tell me an activity linked to, let's say, male homosexuality. I mean, the obvious thing that comes to mind, obviously, an activity linked to the sexual orientation. Wouldn't that be like having sex? So if parents, for example, want to restrict their child from having homosexual sex, that would be coercive, according to this definition. So in the context of conversion practices, controlling actions are used deliberately to restrict, prevent or limit people from living or acting in accordance with their sexual orientation or gender identity. Now, how do you live in accordance with your sexual orientation? I assume that means you're sexually active in accordance with your sexual orientation. What else could it possibly mean? Now, controlling actions by their nature apply a degree of force and give a person no choice other than to regulate their behaviour accordingly. Again, overblown language there, but we've come to expect that, haven't we? So they're still defining the offence here. It says, within conversion practices, manipulating behaviour is likely to involve a perpetrator abusing a position of power or trust to play on an individual's anxieties or beliefs. So if someone's anxious about, say, becoming transgender, and someone says, are you anxious about that? There might be a good reason for that. Maybe we could help. Maybe the solution to this is for this transgender inclination to be dealt with, for it to recede in your life. But that would be playing on a person's anxieties, playing on a person's beliefs. In other words, come on, you're calling yourself a Muslim. This isn't really in accordance with Islamic teaching, the decision you're thinking about making. So I would encourage you to make a different decision. They regard that as playing on a person's beliefs. Sounds quite sinister, doesn't it? So it says, for example, weaponizing a person's religious beliefs. Weaponizing. That would be just the example I just said. The faith that you are espousing, or the faith community in which you are saying you're a member, the values of that community are at odds with the decision you're considering making, or are at odds with a certain course of action that might be open to you. They call that weaponizing a person's religious beliefs. So this has been written by the most extreme and hostile LGBTQI plus, so anti-religious, more commonly anti-Christian campaigners. So a section now called for the avoidance of doubt is basically saying that the sort of treatments offered by the NHS won't be banned by the conversion therapy ban. So including medical treatment intended to align a person's physical characteristics with their gender identity. So in other words, that's fine. So like surgery, etc., transsexual surgery, that's okay. But if you talk to someone in order to help them to align their gender identity with their physical characteristics, then that is banned. That's the thing they want to ban, which is totally backwards, but obviously that's the underlying philosophy here. And it also doesn't cover medical treatment that causes or addresses a lack of sexual desire. So, for example, let's say a gay man feels that he's not experiencing sufficient sexual desire to have sex with other gay men. Then the NHS can help with that. He can be given drugs and treatment, counselling, whatever, to help with that. Whereas if a gay man goes along and says, I actually don't want to feel the sexual desire to have sex with other men, then that's conversion therapy. And if you try and help that man, then you are a criminal. It also talks about a defence of reasonableness. So if you're accused of conversion therapy, you find yourself in court, what's one of the things your lawyer might be able to say in your defence? Well, they might be able to say that your actions were reasonable under the circumstances. Quite a lot of laws have this, just to try and cover some unforeseen, bizarre circumstance where the type of behaviour might have been acceptable for some unusual reason. So let's see. So the reasonableness defence. We anticipate this defence may potentially arise where the immediate safety of the victim was at risk, and acts were carried out to protect them from imminent harm. For example, where someone is at immediate risk of suicide as a result of distress related to their sexual orientation or gender identity, requests and is supported to find a short-term coping mechanism. So someone saying, I'm absolutely at the end of my tether, I've got these same-sex sexual attractions, it's really pushing me to the point of suicide. Can you help me? You're allowed to help that person in the very short term to alleviate the immediate threat. So you can help them very briefly, but in the longer term, obviously you've got to say to them, well, no, you've got to face up to it, that you just need to accept the way you are and act on those desires. I mean, how bizarre is that? And that also applies to gender identity as well. So if someone is very distressed at like feelings of being the wrong gender or whatever, then you're allowed to help them in the very short term to put those feelings to one side or to overcome those feelings. You can do that in the very short term, but in the longer term, you're not allowed to help them in that way. They've just got to face the facts that they are of a different gender, and that's that. It says it could also potentially apply in situations where the specific day-to-day controls implemented by a parent were to prevent a child from engaging in illegal and dangerous behaviour. Again, there's a lot of sexual activities that might be classed as dangerous behaviours. But does anyone really want to have to get to the point where you're in court and your lawyer's coming up with these defences to get you off the hook? I mean, it's not very reassuring, is it? I mean, just going back to the transgender issue, I spoke to a man a little while ago now, a few months ago now, who went through phases where he experienced like gender confusion. He experienced desire to act as, dress as a woman. This was something he regarded as a blight on his life. It really upset him and disturbed him quite severely, and he wanted to escape from those feelings. But as far as this is concerned, you just can't help that sort of person. Maybe in a particular crisis on that day, you can just try and help them. But once that crisis is past, you can't. They're on their own from then on. Punishments for committing this so-called crime: 12 months in prison or £10,000 maximum fine on summary conviction. But on indictment, which is more serious, prison term up to 7 years and unlimited fine, or both. To me, that just sounds vindictive. Right, we're coming now to the issue of consent. This is a crucial part of this. So they're basically saying that consent is no defence. So when the church minister says, look, this person came to me, asked me to help them with this issue, and I helped them. That's my defence. Well, the Scottish Government is making it very clear that that is definitely not a defence at all, which you might think is quite bizarre, but let's listen to their purported reasoning. So evidence suggests that many people who undergo conversion practices agree to do in some way to do so. For example, they may agree to attend a program or therapy. However, those people who apparently willingly engage in or actively seek out conversion practices are often driven by external pressures and coercions, such as imbalanced power dynamics or being under the guidance of powerful people in their life who are in a position of trust or authority, limiting their autonomy. So again, suggesting that LGBTQI plus people, I mean, that's like treating them like children. They can't really make their own decisions. They think they want something, but we know that they really don't. That they're just deluded or they're being exploited in some way. But even the text they've got there, it doesn't say that's the case in every case. So surely the cases where the consent is genuine, then that should be allowed to continue. But we'll come to that again in a minute. It makes a comparison between conversion practices and female genital mutilation. So it says, because you can't consent to female genital mutilation, therefore you also shouldn't be able to consent to having a chat with someone about unwanted sexual attractions. I mean, anyone who thinks that connection is remotely sensible or reasonable has lost the plot, basically. And in the Scottish Parliament, they basically lost the plot. Right, let's continue. We believe that it is extremely difficult to ensure that consent in these circumstances is fully informed. Now, what do they mean by fully informed consent? What they would mean is, so for example, someone goes to their church leader and says, "Can you help me with this? Can you pray with me? Could we meet up every couple of weeks to have a chat?" Then the church leader should say in that situation, as far as the government's concerned, they could say, right, we need to ensure that your consent to this is fully informed. So I'd like to make it clear to you that this is not going to work and it's going to be harmful to you in very serious ways. You might suffer PTSD as a result of it. And then the person would have to say, okay, yeah, that's fine, I'll go ahead regardless. That's what they would mean by informed consent. So again, a very twisted view of the issue. It says, the fact that change is not possible, that's something people should be told. Again, that is just not true. I've talked about that already. So they conclude, for all the reasons set out above, we do not propose to include a defence of consent in relation to the new criminal offences. So more on the issue of consent. They say, we believe that it is not possible to consent to actions that cause harm. Now, the person who wrote this and all the people who proofread this and sat round tables talking about it, I mean, did they think about this at all? It's not possible to consent to actions that cause harm. Smoking. It's pretty widely acknowledged that smoking causes harm, and people are allowed to consent to do it. How about committing adultery? That undoubtedly causes harm. People are permitted to consent to it. You've really got to question that. What are they thinking? How can someone write that and just be so unreflective as to put a sentence like that in a government document? It's depressing. In practice, it would be difficult to prove that harm has been caused in situations where the person has given consent, unless they have later changed their mind. This is a really important section here, and it's quite an admission from them. Just listen to this again. It took me a while to get my head around this. In practice, it will be difficult to prove that harm has been caused in situations where the person has given consent. That's acknowledging that there are people who do consent and will say, it didn't do me any harm, maybe it even did me good. So they're worried that there are some people like that. And the problem with people like that is it might be difficult to prosecute the person who they asked for help and claimed that help did actually assist them. So they're saying they want to be able to get the conversion practice person in that case, and they're saying it will be difficult if consent is a defence. Does that make sense? So that's what they're trying to do. Even cases where the person asks for the help, says the help did indeed help them, they think, they still want to get that person and prosecute them. So that's why there can't be a defence of consent. Now, if a person can't consent, let's just think about that in terms of the requirement for coercion. So according to them, basically all what they call conversion practices amount to being coercive because consent can't genuinely be given. So don't be too reassured about this need for coercion, because they're saying pretty well that coercion is an inherent, unavoidable aspect of conversion practice. It talks about an offence of promoting and advertising conversion practices. I mean, our friend Matthew Greck in Malta, that's the aspect of their law that they brought against him. I put something on Facebook saying, people in Scotland, Christians experiencing unwanted same-sex attraction, could contact Core Issues Trust, and Muslims in the same situation could contact Strong Support. And I then went on to say, when the conversion therapy bill passes, which it will, then this Facebook post, social media post, would be illegal. And that is indeed the case. Right, the next thing that they're making illegal is removing a person from Scotland for conversion practices. So that would amount to, someone wants this sort of support, but it's illegal in Scotland. So someone might say, okay, but how about just going to England? And you could speak to someone there, they'd be able to help you and support you. But if you point a person in that direction, encourage someone to do that, then that could make you a criminal. For example, if the person travelled with them, paid all or most of their travel costs, or made their travel arrangements. Again, it's treating like LGBTQI plus people like children. They're not really responsible for their own decision. It's not that they chose to travel to another country in order to receive the support that they wanted to fulfill their own vision for their own lives. It's that someone has caused them to do that, which is completely wrong. Now, what's going to happen? Just to say about that as well. Now, if you cause your relative to go to Switzerland to be killed, if you pay their airfare and go with them, well, that's absolutely fine, of course. The Scottish government's got no issue with that. It's only if you help someone to go to another country in order to receive the counselling and support that they desire. Now, what's going to happen here, I guess, is that counselling will be offered from other countries. Now, I would guess if someone sets up in England, sitting in front of their computer on Zoom, counselling someone in Scotland, would they be committing a crime? I suggest that they wouldn't be. I can't see how you can commit a crime in Scotland when you're not there, in this case. But maybe some lawyer could clarify that, but I think that's a sort of glaring loophole. It'll be interesting to see what happens then. Maybe it will become routine that, for example, church leaders in Scotland will very quietly and subtly, because they don't want to be prosecuted, suggest they might find support from organisations in England online. They also say conversion practice could be an aggravating factor for other offences. It's quite hard to imagine what that could possibly be. The only thing I could think of is a pretty extreme example. You hear this thing about corrective rape, that apparently in some parts of the world at some points in time, there's been the idea if someone is raped, that will cure them of their homosexuality. Now, I've never heard of that happening in Britain, but let's say that did happen in Scotland. What they're saying is that rape would be a more serious crime because it was in the cause of conversion practice. So if someone, drags a woman into the bushes and rapes her in the middle of the night in the park just for sexual gratification, well, that's quite serious, but it's not as serious as the person who conducts a rape in order to change someone's sexuality. Now, I actually think that's backwards. It's backwards because the person who's raping someone in the mistaken view that might change their sexuality, but at least their motivation could actually be good, even though they're actually wrong in what they're doing. In their own minds, they're thinking they're doing something that's good. Whereas the person who drags a woman off into the bushes and rapes her, that person is not thinking they're doing something good to the woman. He knows he's doing something bad. So I suggest that's backwards. But the whole idea of aggravated offences, as the Scottish Family Party policy, is that it's just wrong. You punish people for the crime. The motive for it is not relevant. Okay, we're on the home straight now, looking at the last bit, which is the civil orders. Now, this is in addition to the crime of conversion therapy, in which someone would be prosecuted and potentially convicted, sent to prison or fined. This is something else through the civil courts. So let's see what this is all about. In some ways, this might be the most concerning aspect of this legislation. So it says, the circumstances of the victim, the relationship between the accused and the victim, or the difficulty in admitting the standard of proof in a criminal court, can be problems, they're saying. In addition, the criminal law provides a response to a crime which has already taken place rather than enabling preventative action. In other words, if you're going to prosecute people for crimes, it's quite difficult to reach the required level of evidence. And in any case, they won't be able to take action for people who actually haven't done anything, haven't committed a crime yet. It can be preventative. So it's going on. It says that conversion practices they've found take place mainly in religious, family and community settings. In other words, they're the things we're intending to target with these civil orders. So it says, victims may be reluctant to report those responsible to the police or give evidence during a criminal trial. Okay, because people know each other quite well, then, getting through to a criminal prosecution might be difficult. So it'll be easier to get this civil process in place as well, to get these civil orders granted in court. So it says, in addition to the criminal law, we believe it is necessary to implement legislation which allows the civil courts to prevent instances of conversion practices from taking place and require protective and preventative actions. In other words, court orders to make people do things or to stop people from doing things. Right, let's get into a bit more detail here. An important feature of the proposed civil orders in relation to conversion practices is their ability to protect specific individuals from an identified risk of harm of conversion practices in a tailored and individualized way. Now, the first thing that comes to my mind when I'm reading that is I think about a family. So let's say a primary school kid goes off to school, learns about conversion practices and how illegal they are and how harmful they are. Then the kid says, oh, my mum and dad have said this to me. My dad said that to me the other day. And then the teacher might say, all right, conversion practice alert, pass this on to social work, pass it on to the police. So it ends up that some court order is given that tells mum and dad, you must not say this again, or you must not restrict the behaviour of your child again in this way. I mean, what an appalling thing that would be. But I think that's what they've got in mind. It's difficult to see what else they could have in mind. So I'm pretty confident that's what they've got in mind. That a court order restricting the behaviour and speech of parents on the basis of basically concerns raised by a child. All right, let's carry on. We've also identified value in legislating for a civil order that will relate to conduct which puts the public or community at large at risk. I mean, it's horrible to even read this stuff because the language is also warped, puts them at risk. Again, so this is not about an individual. This is like the wider population of Scotland is endangered, apparently, by certain people. Right, in this situation, there would not be the requirement of a named victim. This will be particularly useful for preventing harm caused by individuals or institutions that conduct conversion practices on a wider scale. Now, if an institution was conducting conversion practices on a wide scale, surely there should be criminal prosecutions left, right and centre. So this is designed primarily to be preventative, right? These institutions, I wonder what they would be. Can you imagine what they would be? Well, all I can think of is churches. I mean, in theory, other religious organisations as well, but obviously the campaigners are not going to go after them. They're going to go after churches. So what I would imagine would happen with this is a couple of activists would find a few sermons online from a church, go along to the church, speak to a few people, then go and make a report that they think there's a risk that this church might carry out conversion practices. And then, who knows, some sort of court order might be placed on the church. I'll talk about that a bit later. But how about the Scottish Family Party with our placard, a man can't become a woman, simple? What if someone reported that as a concern that we might engage in conversion practices? Would that be taken seriously? I think very possibly it would. So who can apply for these court orders? If it's to do with an individual at so-called risk, then that person themselves can apply for it. And remember, that can include a child in the family home, or the police or local authority, or another person, a third party could report that as well. If it's to the wider community, alleged risk to the wider community, it needs to be the police or the local authority. Right, do you trust either of those bodies to be neutral and sensible with regard to this sort of issue? Well, obviously not. But what would happen is that a couple of activists would target a church, listen to a few sermons online, have a few conversations, maybe record them on their phone, and then go along to the police or the council saying, we're concerned that there's a risk of conversion practices taking place in this church. We think it'd be good to get a civil order telling them some things they're not allowed to do. And I think that's exactly what will happen. Right, a bit more about this protecting the wider community aspect. So it's to prevent an individual from, so the order could prevent an individual from attending a particular premises or type of premises where they have previously engaged in conversion practices. Now, what on earth are they thinking there? Let's say someone had engaged in what they call conversion practice in an office somewhere. They've got some office space, a little meeting room, and they met with someone and engaged in what was regarded as conversion practice. So the court order could say you're not allowed to go to that premises or to that type of premises. So a court order saying you're not allowed to go to offices. I mean, it doesn't make any sense, does it? I mean, what's the only sort of premises where this could make any sense? Well, all I can think of where it would make any sense at all would be churches. And I'm imagining we might find church leaders banned from going to church buildings. Let's see. So the purposes of the protection orders. So the purpose of the civil protection order is to prevent or reduce the likelihood of harm that arises from this conduct, whether to a specific individual or people in Scotland more generally. In situations where the order has been used to protect a specific identified individual, there does not need to be evidence that conversion practices have already taken place. Instead, there needs to be evidence of a risk of conversion practices taking place. I say what the evidence could be. It could be, accounts from a child. It could be sermons online, etc., etc. Now, this sort of court order, I mean, they could claim, we're not saying you've done anything wrong. We're just saying you'd better not. But it's a bit like the hate incident system, because the court procedure would be public. It would be known that your church or this particular minister or these parents have got a court order against them that prevents them from engaging in conversion practices. And really anyone with traditional moral values would be at risk of having one of these orders being made against them. And once you've got that, your reputation is impugned. It's quite embarrassing, isn't it? People would really make the most of that, wouldn't they? So you've got, just to say, you've got a court order against you, haven't you, to prevent you from causing harm to certain people. Well, yes, I have. Not good, but I think it's pretty clear that that's what's coming with this legislation. Still on the issue of these court orders, I'm looking at the actual draft text of the bill now that's included in the consultation documents. And these court orders could include, it says, prohibition on taking any protected person from or to such place as is specified in the order. So you're not allowed to take the person to a certain place. What could that certain place be? I think the obvious application that I'd be pretty confident they've got in mind is parents taking their children to church. So they would envisage a court order saying, parents, you are not allowed to take your 6-year-old or whatever to church. And there's another one as well. This one is even more perplexing. A requirement to facilitate or otherwise enable any protected person to return or go to such place as is specified in the order within such period as is so specified. In other words, you've got to facilitate someone being able to go to a certain place when they want to. Again, what could it possibly mean? The only application I can think of, which I'm guessing is what they've got in mind, is when you get some person saying, I don't feel I can go to my church because I'm worried they're going to conversion practice me. And then the court order could be, you have to welcome this person and enable them to come back to your church. So if you've said they're not a member anymore, or they're not welcome because they keep spreading views that are not compatible with the church. So it's the only application I can think of is a church could be told you have to allow a person to attend and be part of the community. Who knows quite what it would amount to? So we shall see. All right, one last little thing in the recommendations at the end. It talks about education. Of course, it said, we will explore how to best educate children and young people, as well as the general public, on what conversion practices are and the detrimental effect that they have on victims' lives. So the lesson in school would be, if anyone tries to say to you, they don't think, being gay, for example, is a good idea, or it's not a good path to go down, or they think changing gender isn't a positive move, that it's better to, come into alignment with your actual sex. If anyone says that to you, that's called conversion practice. That's illegal. That's a crime, because it's really, really harmful for you, and it will have a massively detrimental effect on you. Now, so it's planting that seed. Well, it's more than planting. This is planting it, fertilizing it and watering it and looking after it to grow it as big as it can possibly be. So it's basically priming people to complain about this. And also from the point of view of LGBT people who do want to seek support, it's telling them, teaching them from school, forget it, it's not going to work. You're stuck with it. You're the way you are and it's not going to change. You're not going to be able to suppress it. And so you may as well give up now. Embrace your identity and get on with that lifestyle to, and manifest that orientation or gender identity. It says tailored and targeted community outreach programs would be considered to ensure that no area of society is left out. I would imagine there that they would particularly target immigrant communities, minority religions, etc. That's what the Scottish Government has done on other similar issues. So that's what I would imagine is going to be happening there. Right, to conclude, well done for getting this far. Hopefully you've learnt a lot about this bill, and that will be valuable information for you going forward. So to conclude, to go back to introduction, Kate Forbes is completely wrong. Conversion practices are not abhorrent. They're compassionate and in many cases effective, helpful and effective, and they meet a need of a certain section of the population. I mean, themes coming through this document, they treat LGBT people like children, that they can't really make their own mind up. It's the government that really knows what they want. They don't really know what they want, so the government needs to decide for them. The government completely denies the facts and just denies the experience of many, many people. So people say, this is my story of how my sexuality or gender identity changed or developed, and the government says, no, you're lying. Shut up, go away. You've got no place in modern Scotland. We don't want to hear those sort of stories in modern Scotland. And the language used throughout this report is routinely hysterical, grossly overblown. The main driver of this legislation, I think, is a hatred of the thought that anyone might disapprove or not want to go down the route of homosexuality or transgenderism. That is the main driver behind it. I think it's not really coincidence, the fact that we've got two laws coming at once that are both heading towards banning forms of prayer. We've got the buffer zone legislation that says, well, does it say, I don't know, it seems to be intended to restrict people like silently praying in the street near an abortion clinic. And now we've got this trying to criminalise praying for someone with regard to their sexual orientation or gender identity. Now the Conservatives, I've mentioned them already. Do remember it was in their manifesto at the last Scottish election. So if you voted Conservative, my challenge to you would be, well, you voted for this. So as much as you might object to it now, and as much as the Conservatives themselves might object to it in some ways, then you can remember that it was in their manifesto. What will happen is the Conservatives will criticise the gender identity aspect of it. The sexual orientation aspect will probably go pretty well unchallenged in the Scottish Parliament, but there will be a big campaign against the gender identity aspect of it, which may or may not get watered down for political reasons. We shall see. Other major theme is this is vague. I mean, the poor old police, they've just about got their head around the hate speech legislation and worked out how they can try and implement that. And then no sooner is that in action, then they're going to get this. I mean, the police won't be able to know how to deal with it because it's so vague and imprecise. It's going to take a huge amount of police time because vindictive and aggressive activists are going to be making reports left, right and centre and just eliciting reports from people as well to try to stir up trouble. It's a further example of the Scottish Government interfering in family life. This could be one of the most severe interferences yet, and they're also looking to interfere in the activities of religious organisations, in particular churches, I would say. Right, I think in terms of this legislation, is it going to pass? Well, it's going to pass in some form or other. Is the UK government going to knock it back? Well, they might do on some technicality, but basically this sort of legislation has been introduced all over the world. The UK government was on the point of doing something very similar itself very recently. So I think it is going to pass, but this is a wider fight. We've got to fight this piece of legislation. It may or may not get tweaked, but we can't be in the mindset of, okay, you fight a little battle, you lose, then you forget about it. Then you fight the next little battle, you lose that one, then you forget about that issue. We've got to get to the point where we've got people in the Parliament, influence in the Parliament, that's saying, right, we've got to go back. There's quite a few things now that have gone wrong. We need to go back and fix them. Not just keeping dragging our heels over the latest terrible idea that's going through the Scottish Parliament. And if you want to bring about that situation where these things are not just challenged when they come up, but also we go back and put right the mistakes of the past, you've got to change how you vote. And you've got to change your political allegiance very possibly. And I would suggest you need to join and support the Scottish Family Party. We will be delighted to welcome you as a member and to see you at our meetings and activists, but you don't need to do that as a member, or you can become a regular donor. If for some reason you don't want to have to say you're a member of a political party, you can still support us by being a regular donor, and we send you the same communications that we do to members. So there is a link below, and we will be delighted to welcome you. Right, thanks for watching, and well done.